This is why, by the way, the Ukraine war, even once it's settled and becomes a frozen conflict, will be so dangerous, right? Because the fact that it is a defeat for the West and that we have been humiliated and that we lost this major war that we were so deeply committed to will give people incentives to try to reverse the tide, to rescue the situation. And when people are desperate, they sometimes pursue very risky strategies. So once this war becomes a frozen conflict, we're going to have to worry about it re-escalating.
And that was Professor John Mearsheimer on Tucker Carlson. That's just it's on fire everywhere on both X and in the internet with YouTube there. And as you see, we have Professor Mearsheimer back on the show again today. So we're really, really grateful to have you back on today. And I was really eager to have you, especially right after you were on with the Tucker thing, because I wanted to zero in on that specific part of it. That whole interview, and we recommend everybody go watch that thing. It's a soaring survey, really, of foreign policy writ large, kind of talk about so many different topics. But I want to zero in on this one today because it's the issue of what happens once this war's over. And as you and I talk nearly every time we're on here, this war is the conclusion is already known. It's just we don't know when that conclusion will be reached or what the eventual price tag is, but it's going to be lost by the Western side and won by the Russian side. But the question is, what comes next and what happens after that? And so that's what we'd like to discuss with you today. So first of all, just right off the top, I wonder what your thoughts were on what you mean when you say a frozen conflict.
Well, I don't think, Danny, that there's going to be a diplomatic solution. You're not going to reach some sort of meaningful peace agreement between Russia on one side and Ukraine and the West on the other. I think this war is going to be settled on the battlefield. And at some point, I believe it will stop. The Russians will be seen as the winner. It will be an ugly victory in the sense that I don't think the Russians are going to decisively defeat Ukraine. I think there will be a dysfunctional Ukrainian rump state left over. And of course, the Russians will end up taking at least those 4 oblasts that they've already annexed, plus Crimea. And in all likelihood, they'll end up taking even more territory. And the end result is you'll get a frozen conflict similar to what you have between the two Koreas. It'll be an armistice in effect. That's coming. And then the $64,000 question is what happens after that?
And so let's take a look at that. Well, and actually, let me get a running start on this, because what could be a setup that you said that there won't be a diplomatic solution. Well, it seems like we have a near-term, maybe starting block to that with Trump's, first of all, his 50-day deadline, which turned into a 10-day deadline, which will expire on 9 August, so a week from Saturday. And it seems to me that he's kind of set himself up for this would be the last opportunity for diplomacy, because he said, if we don't get this deal, which is the deal he's looking for, is an unconditional 30-day ceasefire from Russia by a week from Saturday, which of course, as you know well, more better than anyone, that's not even on the table for a possibility. So when that day comes and we don't get it, then Trump says he's ready to start throwing all these tariffs and all this kind of stuff. And that's his last card. So if he doesn't get capitulation on that, do you see any other pathway that he could even later on try to do some more diplomacy?
No. I mean, this is a fool's errand. I mean, the Russians have made it clear there's going to be no ceasefire. And what we need is an agreement. And that agreement has to accept the core Russian demands that were enunciated last June 14th of 2024. Putin laid them out to the Russian foreign ministry, and they've been repeated by Putin and his lieutenants on countless occasions. And we are not going to accept those terms. The Ukrainians are not going to accept those terms, and the West Europeans or the Europeans are not going to accept those terms. So there's going to be no ceasefire. And again, this is going to be settled on the battlefield. And by the way, just in terms of what President Trump is now doing, threatening secondary sanctions and so forth and so on. That's just making a bad situation worse. There's hardly any chance of diplomacy tamping down tensions between the West and Russia. We're just exacerbating the situation.
Yeah, and in fact, I want to actually ask you a little bit about that since we're touching on that topic right now. I mean, I think we can probably agree that it's certainly not going to have any impact on the course of the war, but on the economic battlefield, if you will, on a bigger level for our own selves. I mean, we're already in really tense and difficult negotiations with China to trying to get some kind of a trade deal. We're also working, and in fact, things are not looking good with Brazil. Already they're angry about the existing situation, and now on top of those difficult times and whatever we have been doing on both for months now, you want to slap a new 100% on there? I mean, how is that even functionally going to work?
Well, I don't think he's going to do it. I think it's all talk and he'll walk it back. Actually, I think the country that's most important in this regard is India. Relations between the United States and India were supposed to be terrific under Donald Trump because Trump and Modi, the Indian leader, have historically been good. But it's been all downhill since Trump moved into the White House. And he's now threatening to put secondary sanctions on India. They've not worked out a trade deal with India. And the Indians are actually furious with Trump. And we need India on our side of the ledger because for purposes of containing China and dealing with China, we need friendly relations with India. Remember, India is part of the Quad. It's just hard to believe what's going on here. He's poisoning relations with India. He can't do much with the Chinese because the Chinese have too much leverage over us. They control those rare earths and rare earth magnets, and there are just limits to what Trump can do in terms of getting tough with the Chinese.
Well, let's look at it even with India. What's even in the realm of theoretical possibility? He says he doesn't want them to take any Russian oil. Well, if India suddenly were to say, all right, fine, if we have to choose, I guess we'll choose America over Russia, and suddenly they don't buy that oil, what would that do to their economy, and how would they replace that oil? Where else would they get it?
It would wreck their economy. I mean, they're not going to do it. And the Chinese are not going to do it. And this is why I don't understand why Trump is making these threats. Does he really think that this makes sense? It's typical Trump. He just, operates by the seat of his pants, makes all these threats, then backs off, and so forth and so on. And by the way, if you're the Russians and you're watching this, you have to say to yourself, what does this tell us about dealing with the United States moving forward? Is there any hope for diplomacy? Is there any hope that we can work out some sort of modus vivendi with these people? I think the answer is no. I think if you're the Russians and you're the Indians and you're the Chinese and you're pretty much every other country in the world except for Israel, and you're looking at the United States, you have to say to yourself, this is a rogue actor. This is a rogue state. This is a state that can't be trusted. And you have to assume worst case. You have to plan for that. And you have to act accordingly. This is not in our interest.
No, it's definitely not. And that's with Russia, our geopolitical adversary, if you want to use that terminology, certainly not friend at the moment. But I had lunch yesterday in Washington with a member of the diplomatic corps here, foreign diplomatic corps, who's from a country very friendly to the United States. And this person runs in circles with other diplomats, et cetera. And the guy told me about two particular issues with Japan and South Korea, which were really, really unhappy about how they're being treated by the United States in these trade negotiations and how they're being coerced and forced into deals that are definitely bad for them, could be great for us, but it's not a win-win, it's a lose-win. And they are not happy at all about being forced to make these kinds of decisions about either a bad deal or a horrible deal to stick with the tariffs, et cetera. And this person also told me that The Chinese have been whispering more into their ears, kind of along the lines you mentioned about trust. Do you really want to hook your wagon to these guys and stay there long term instead of us? And this person said, well, there's some bad baggage from the Chinese and how we've been treated by them in the past as well. But now we're listening. Do you see any concerns that listening could turn into action later?
Who knows? I'm a structural realist, and I believe structure really matters. And I believe if you're Japan and you're South Korea, the mere fact that you live right next door to China makes China a threat that can never approximate the American threat, because the Pacific Ocean is a huge body of water and we're far away. All of that's to say that from a structural point of view, there are very powerful incentives for the Japanese and the South Koreans to ally with the United States no matter what. But I'm sophisticated enough, at least I hope, to understand that structure has its limits. And one could argue that if the United States continues to misbehave, if President Trump continues to slap our allies around, and here we're talking about the South Koreans and the Japanese, who are two of our most important allies, that at some point they will be forced to work out some sort of accommodation with China, which will be to China's advantage, because China is far more powerful than either one of those countries, or in fact, those two countries combined together. So one could argue that, Trump, Trump made Trump's structure, if you know what I'm saying here, Danny. So I think we have to be very careful. I find it hard to believe that Trump doesn't understand that for purposes of containing China, it's essential to have good relations with South Korea and Japan. And slapping them around the way he does makes absolutely no strategic sense. But he just doesn't seem to care. And by the way, just to take this a step further, the United States is pinned down in the Middle East, and the United States is pinned down in Ukraine. And that has made it very difficult for the United States to fully pivot to East Asia to contain China. You would think, given that situation, the United States would have a deep-seated interest in, if anything, being on better relations than ever with both the South Koreans and the Japanese. But what we see is the exact opposite, as you just described.
Yeah. Well, I don't understand it either. It's my puzzler is not working very well. Okay, I want to shift on over to our primary target here today, and that's with this issue of the frozen conflict. Since I first heard that statement that you made there, and of course you've said it on our show several times, I started really thinking more about it and kind of looking through the landscape here through a different lens through that, because I've always been so focused on what's happening on the ground today and how will the conflict come to an end. And I've spent very little time looking at what happens on the other side of it, however it turns out. And the more I did, the more I'm, I guess, a little bit concerned here, because I see what could appear to be, from a number of different sources, people seem to mentally be preparing for that day already. And let's start off with this was on Fox News, I think yesterday or day before, from former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, who's certainly well tied in with a lot of Republicans. And so not so much what he says here personally, but that he's saying things that a lot of others believe, and that a lot of the things that he says are held as facts by people. And I'm guessing you're going to have a little bit of a difference of opinion on what constitutes a fact.
For some reason, Putin believed that Trump was like Biden or like Obama, that he could push him around, he could lie to him. Much of it's been blatant, where Putin will talk nice in the morning, and that evening they'll bomb, an orphanage or a hospital or a senior citizen home, and somehow we're supposed to be too stupid to realize that we're basically having a Russian dictator who has contempt for us. Well, that's a huge mistake if you do that to Donald Trump, because he's not Obama, he's not Bill Clinton, he's not Joe Biden. And I think what you'll see in the very near future is very dramatic increase in sanctions. And I suspect you're going to see a very significant increase in both the flow of weapons and in targeting accuracy to allow those weapons to be used inside Russia.
So several things I want to pull out here, and let's start with the first one. Putin always lies. I hear that all the time. You can't take anything he says at face value. He lies all the time. And as an example, he tries to reiterate something that Trump has been saying, that in his phone calls with Putin, Putin tells him in the morning with happy voices, everything's going to be great. And then all of a sudden he's bombing, buildings and whatever later on and killing a lot of civilians. But I've seen no evidence that Putin lied about anything, that he just told him, we're not going to have a ceasefire. We are going to keep fighting, but we'd love to talk. How do you see that part about the Putin lies part?
Just building on what you said, Danny, I think you can disagree with Putin's position, but he has been remarkably consistent in his pronouncements and his behavior. He has made it unequivocally clear from the get-go that there will be no ceasefire until there is a peace agreement. And he stipulated what that peace agreement has to look like. And he's made it clear that he's unwilling to bend on what he thinks the main terms of that peace agreement should be. There's no evidence whatsoever that he was telling Trump something different than that. All of the evidence is that he has been telling the same story over and over. So this idea that, Putin is deceptive, he's been leading Trump down the primrose path, making it look like they were going to have an agreement and then welching on the deal at the last moment. This is nonsense. This is the kind of rhetoric we get from Trump, because Trump just tells stories. Facts don't matter to Trump, right? He just, tells stories off the top of his head. And it's to his advantage, he thinks, to portray Putin as the good guy and himself as Putin is the bad guy and himself is the good guy. And that's why we end up in the situation that we're in. And we end up having to listen to Newt Gingrich spew this nonsense.
Yeah, and that tails right off Trump's recent claims that 5 or maybe 4 times I thought we had a deal with Putin, and then all of a sudden he does all this other kind of stuff. So that feeds into that narrative, which, as you say, from readouts that happened on the day of the phone call, there's no evidence that anything like that happened. There's no reason that Trump should ever have thought he had a deal, because unless he was ready to agree to the June 14, 2024 lines, that would have been a different situation. No evidence that happened.
That's exactly right, Danny. That hits the nail right on the head. There is no evidence that they were close to a deal. None.
And yet that goes, but then see, that feeds into the narrative that Russia can't be trusted, that they're going to lie all the time. So how do you make a deal with somebody you can't trust? Or, in the other part of that comment there, he said, that Russia has, not just that they were firing missiles after that phone call, but that they were attacking orphanages, hospitals, and old folks' homes. I mean, he's handpicking the worst of the worst, which, by the way, Zelensky is claiming as well. No military targets, just terror targets. So they're casting Russia first as liars, and then now as basically animals that are just going after old people and kids. What do you say to that?
Look, I've spent a big chunk of my life studying war, and I know a lot about air campaigns. And what people like Trump and Gingrich and others are trying to say is that the Russians are waging a counterpopulation air war. In other words, they're purposely trying to kill large numbers of civilians, much the way we did against Japan and even Germany in World War II. This is simply not true. There's no question that there is collateral damage. Civilians are killed when the Russians attack military targets from the air. But if you examine the targets that the Russians are going after, and you look at the small numbers of civilians who are killed in almost all these attacks, it shows very clearly that this is not a counterpopulation air war. It's designed to take out military targets, not to kill civilians. And in fact, Putin has been criticized inside his own country for not waging the air war aggressively enough. But the fact is, he has limited the air campaign, which is extensive for sure. And again, it does involve killing some civilians in the form of collateral damage. a phrase I hate, by the way, but captures the essence of what's going on. But he's going after military targets.
And there are some, like, for example, overnight, just last night in Kiev, there was like a 9-story apartment building which collapsed and was hit. So it's unclear whether that was a Russian missile that was errant or an air defense missile that missed its target and then hit. And apparently that happens quite a bit of time. Or a third, which I have heard from someone who had direct on the ground experience, that sometimes Ukraine will actually put its military in civilian buildings, etc., thinking that they're safe, or then they'll charge this. I don't know, but here's the thing that we do know, and this was admitted by Jack Keane just earlier this week, which we've had a soundbite on. In his attempt to demonize the Russians, he said over 13,000 civilians have been killed in this war in Ukraine, and this terrorist activity that the Russians are doing, etc. Well, then you look at Gaza, which even by the low official number, somewhere around 60,000 people have been killed. Civilians have been killed in that. Some say it's up over 300,000. Who knows what the real number is? We won't find that out probably till a long time. But 13,000 compared to 60,000 in a total population of 2 million. That tells you okay. Got some rock and roll there. That tells you right there that it's not a target of the Russian military to go after civilians, or that number would be substantially higher after 3.5 years of war.
2 other points, Danny. And of course, I agree with what you say, but a lot of the fighting between the Russians and the Ukrainians has taken place inside of cities. And as you know better than I do, when you fight a war inside a city, the defender is going to go into buildings. The defender is going to go into apartment buildings. And the offender, which of course in this case is the Russians, is going to bring a lot of firepower to bear to get at those defenders who are in those apartment buildings. And in the process, civilians are going to be killed. Again, this is the whole point about collateral damage. And the second point I would make is I actually believe that the Ukrainians have ended up killing a substantial number of civilians themselves. And I think this often happens when you have a war between two sides. The defender sometimes ends up killing some of its own people. But the more general point, which is supported by what you said, is that if you look at the everyday reports that are coming out on these air assaults by the Russians, it's actually quite striking how few civilians are killed. I think it's deeply regrettable that any civilians are killed, and I don't want to make light of that fact. But, you will read the Russians launched this major attack and Ukraine is saying 13 civilians were killed. Well, if 13 civilians were killed, you can't say this is the equivalent of Hamburg or Dresden or Tokyo in March of 1945. It's nothing like that, right? This is a bombing campaign that's aimed at military targets.
And that's, we see that's what turns out when we look at the actual evidence. One last thing I want to highlight from that Newt Gingrich comment there, because I think it's also something that we get wrong in a different direction, and that is overstating what we can do. Because he ended that by saying, I think what you're about to see on the 9th of November is a substantial waylaying of sanctions, that this time it's going to have a big impact, and that there's going to be even more armor and weapons and other kind of things given, which he's implying is going to somehow change the fortunes on the ground. But gracious, I don't know how anyone could think that any kind of pittance that Trump can throw now after what's been given over the last 3.5 years cumulatively by the United States and NATO countries, which have not had any impact on the battlefield. Why do people still have this idea that a little bit by Trump now will do what none of the mountain of stuff has done before?
Who knows? I mean, you listen to Gingrich talk and you just sort of wonder what universe is this guy operating in. I mean, the fact is we don't have a substantial amount of weaponry to give the Ukrainians. Pure and simple. This has been a problem that's been talked about for months now. the weaponry is just not there to give them. It's not like Trump has all of this weaponry sitting on the shelf and all he has to do is reach up and grab it and ship it off to the Ukrainians, and in the process get our European allies to pay for it, and we all live happily ever after. I mean, this is nonsense. We don't have the weaponry. And furthermore, as you and I have talked about before, at this point, it appears that the biggest problem that the Ukrainians face is actually not weaponry. It's not to say weaponry isn't a huge problem, but the biggest problem they face is manpower. And we can't solve that problem. And then you get to all this talk about secondary sanctions. I mean, we've said a few words about that. If secondary sanctions really were an effective tool, the Biden administration, which was deeply committed to winning this war against Russia, would have used them. They didn't, and they didn't use them because they're not going to work. And Trump can talk all he wants about using secondary sanctions, as can Gingrich, but I don't believe that Trump is going to use those secondary sanctions. And if he does, it would be a remarkably foolish move on his part.
Yeah, and which still wouldn't have any impact on the ground. Although that does make me wonder what Trump has in mind, because he made a big to-do yesterday on Air Force One of saying the deadline will be in 10 days from today. And you'll see, and you see Gingrich there, I think you're going to see something big. Well, if nothing big materializes, well, I almost said people will start to ask him questions, but I think that he's immune to that. So there may not be anything. Moving on to your Senator John Kennedy. He went on the Senate floor recently to talk about what fair-minded Americans actually think.
I think most fair-minded people can agree on two things. Number one, Vladimir Putin, who runs Russia, not the people of Russia, but their leadership, is a thug. He's a pirate. He has blood under his fingernails. He can't be trusted. I think Ukraine is willing to negotiate a reasonable settlement, but it takes two to tango, and we're not going to have a settlement until President Putin decides it is in his best interest to stop the war. Not Russia's best interest, because I don't think he cares about his people. I think the war will stop when Putin thinks it's in his best interest. And I don't think he's going to think it's in his best interest until he feels the pressure, Mr. President. Because dealing with Putin is like dealing with most tyrants. It's like hand-feeding a shark. Okay? You can't reason with him.
Okay, so you see, again, the demonization of Russia. The leader is a tyrant, a pirate, has blood under his fingernails, can't be trusted. There's that thing again. So you can't ever listen to him. And only when you force him by compulsive actions are you going to get him to do anything. So to me, this is just setting up post this war, this mentality. And it seems like they're reinforcing a lot of these same themes, that Russia is just this evil actor with no reasonable positions at all. So they have to be gone after. We have to push back on them. How do you see that developing?
I agree 100%. I mean, the Russophobia in the West, and this includes, of course, the United States, is off the charts. And this is just evidence of that phenomenon. And I would say to you, sort of building on what you've said up to now, that it's hard to imagine when we are finally defeated in Ukraine, when this war shuts down, the shooting stops, and you have a frozen conflict, that the American foreign policy elite is going to accept its defeat and move on. We're not going to accept defeat. We're going to continue to do what we can to undermine Russia's position in the territories that it has acquired from Ukraine and in Eastern Europe more generally. We are going to have, in all likelihood, a very antagonistic relationship with Russia for the foreseeable future. And when you listen to people like Newt Gingrich and Senator Kennedy speak, there's just lots of evidence there that that's where we're headed.
Unfortunately, it's not limited to them. I could pull out just a recent soundbite we had from Lindsey Graham, who was talking about how we're going to whoop Putin's ass and, that we can. And all these things are going to have, more and more of this confrontation. Obviously, he's been that way from the outset, but he has not shied back at all, even in recent days. So he's continuing that. And then his partner in crime, Senator Blumenthal, is talking again about the sledgehammer he wants to bring crashing down on Russia.
President Trump's action on military aid and sanctions is really welcome. It's a positive step, but our Russia sanctions bill would be a sledgehammer, not just a hammer. It would be even stronger than what the president's proposing, because 500% tariffs on India, China, Brazil, if they continue buying Russia oil and gas, would be bone crushing. And that's the kind of penalty that should be imposed on them for supporting and fueling Russia's criminal war machine and their absolute atrocities. We need stronger action, even than President Trump has proposed, and I will continue to press for our Russia sanctions bill.
One of the first things that really jumped out to me from watching that is the absolute absence of any irony on his part of saying that he wants all these secondary sanctions and tariffs on China, Brazil, India, etc., for supporting Russia's war and all these criminal things it's doing, oblivious to the fact that we brag about how we have 50 nations that support the Ukraine in their war against Russia, or in Israel in its slaughter of so many people in Palestine. Doesn't even have a hint of irony that he's condemning Russia for doing the exact same thing that we're doing times two.
Yeah, that's like when Kennedy talks about Putin having blood under his fingernails. I would ask the senator, which leader, Trump or Putin, is complicitous in a genocide? And the answer is very simple: Donald Trump, not Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is waging a good old-fashioned war in Ukraine. You can blame Putin for being an aggressor, think that he was wrong to start that war. You can think that he violated international law. That's all fine. But the fact is that Putin is not waging a genocide. He's not supporting a genocide. Donald Trump, on the other hand, much like his predecessor, Joe Biden, are inextricably bound up with Benjamin Netanyahu in executing a genocide in Gaza. So I think the hypocrisy here on the part of American foreign policy elites is just simply off the charts.
And that's something that is a real problem to those who actually love this country and love what it, at least on paper, stands for and what it used to stand for. To see it so blatantly violated by leaders such as this who are supporting it is just kind of parenthetical information, just very distressing. But back to the topic at hand. Okay, so that's how you see in the United States from a number of different voices and leaders trying to build this case that Russia is this basically demonic organization that is just hell-bent on destruction and killing people. So that's laying the foundation for what may come next, which is more conflict, or whether it's a Cold War or anything else. That's not all of it. Now I'm going to shift over to NATO. So here is Mark Rutte, interestingly enough. This is on 14 March, talking about, he was asked a question of, once this war is over, will the West be able to do business with Russia again? Here's what he said.
Before you were Secretary General of NATO, you ran a European country. Would you be willing to do business again with Russia after this? Because we are hearing reports of things like maybe gas deals come back into play.
Well, I mean, I'm not there because, first of all, you have to maintain the pressure on the Russians to make sure that they do whatever is necessary. That's why we have the sanctions, and let's not be naive about the Russians. But longer term, Russia is there. I mean, Russia will not go away. And I've had many dealings with President Putin till 2014. In my first 4 years as Prime Minister, we had many negotiations. And I think it is normal, if the war would have stopped, for Europe to somehow, step by step, and also for the U.S., step by step, to restore normal relations with the Russians. But we are absolutely not there yet. We have to maintain the pressure on them to make sure that they are willing to engage seriously in talks with the American administration, and of course also with the Ukrainians.
Now, that was on the 14th of March. So he's kind of like, well, we got to keep the pressure on, and that's kind of the consistent thing. But it's like, I mean, they're there. We're going to have a deal with them. 13 days later, however, he did a 180.
There'll be no normalization of relations with Russia when the war is over. That will not happen. That will take decades because there is a total lack of confidence. As I said in my speech, even if the war comes to a conclusion, the Russian threat is still there. They are building a war economy. They are spending so much money on defense. They are producing in 3 months an ammunition what the whole of the alliance is producing in a year. We are ramping up our ammunition production. Luckily, we have to. So there's no way that we can normalize relations with Russia after the war is over. You hope in many decades from now and post-Putin that there might be some, but I mean, I'm not optimistic.
So I got a couple things I want to ask you about that, but let's start with the first one. Why such a strong difference between what he said on the 14th of March and on the 27th of March?
Well, I think he's come to realize, as most European leaders have, that they have a vested interest in the war continuing. It's important to understand that if you want to keep the United States in Europe, you want the Ukraine war to continue, and you want the Americans to remain committed to that war. So what you see is that the European elites, are fueling this war. They have no interest in working out a meaningful peace agreement. They've contested Donald Trump at every turn when he's pursued trying to achieve a meaningful peace agreement. And that's because they want the war to go on. And at the same time, of course, they want to keep the Americans in. And the way you do that is you threat inflate so that you can get the domestic publics, you can get the publics in these countries to ante up and pay more money for defense. And that will make Donald Trump happy. It will make the Americans think the Europeans are pulling their fair share. And therefore, the Americans will stay in Europe. They won't see the Europeans as pure free riders. You could expect the Europeans to be talking like Ruta for the foreseeable future.
And, you know, when I think it was either after the first or second phone call between Trump and Putin, in the aftermath of that, both leaders in their readouts and then in subsequent conversations said, you know, yeah, we had a good interaction, a good phone call, because we're looking at things that go further. They both talked about how in some of their longer phone calls, they talked about the Russia-Ukraine war, but they also talked about deals that could be done afterwards and how they could normalize the relations. But then you seem to have from the European side want to sabotage that. They don't even want to talk about normalizing relations.
Yeah, that's what I said. And that's because they want the war to go on. The Europeans are not interested in settling the war. They've made.
Okay, I mean, just talk us through the logic of that. Why would you not want the war to end so that you can get that stuff sealed off and get back to building economies and making people, you know, prosperous and all that kind of stuff? How does that help people by having the war going on?
Because they want to keep the Americans in Europe. Their principal goal is to keep the American pacifier firmly intact. And the great fear is that we'll leave. And if you settle the war, there's no more conflict in Ukraine. That gives us an opportunity to leave and to pivot to Asia. These people fully understand that, again, going back to structure, from a structural point of view, the United States should be leaving Europe, pivoting away from Europe, and pivoting to East Asia. China is the peer competitor, not Russia. But as long as this war is going on and we're bogged down in the war, and the Americans are involved, and as you see, Danny, we can't get out, right? The first part of the show today focused on that very point. We can't get out. We're stuck there. Well, they want us to remain stuck there because they want us to remain in Europe. So the idea is to let the war go on and on.
That is such an immoral position as well, because it's the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian soldiers, even the Russian soldiers are the bill payers for that madness. But again, these days, you talk about blood under fingernails. There's a lot of fingernails I'd like to examine, because I think there's a bunch of red going on, because we seem to have so little care about the value of human life these days. But Anyway, I digress on that. That's an important issue. Okay, that's the European view. That's the United States view, which now seems to be being dragged into perpetuating something even after this war comes to a conclusion. Several places there, both Newt Gingrich and Kennedy and Blumenthal, they all talk about basically how evil and wicked those Russians are, and you can't trust them, etc. But let's take a look and listen a little bit to what the Russians actually say. Compare that with what the actions that we see, and see who's closer to the truth and who's not. First of all, this is in Putin. I think this was after the election of Donald Trump in November of 2024, talking about how he would like to see the conflict resolved.
It is not Russia, but the United States who have destroyed the system of international security. And they are trying to preserve their hegemony and stoking a global conflict. We have always preferred, and we still prefer, to resolve our disagreements using peaceful means, but we are prepared for any scenario. And if anyone has any doubts, they shouldn't. There will always be a response.
There will always be a response, but he's looking to get this conflict solved. He'd like to talk about that, and in his telling, it's the United States and the West that keep this conflict going. Who's closer to telling the truth there?
There's no question that he's telling the truth, Putin. Look, in the run-up to the war starts on February 24th, 2022. The Russians went to significant lengths, I'm choosing my words carefully here, to avoid a war. They were interested in trying to come up with a diplomatic solution. And we basically, and here we're talking about the Biden administration, told them that we were not interested. If you look at the diplomacy or the absence of diplomacy in December of 2021, January and February of 2022, it's really quite stunning how little interest the United States had in finding a diplomatic solution. You know, the United States during those 3 months was running around saying war is likely, war is likely. You would expect us, given that we thought a war was likely, to try to find some sort of diplomatic solution, that we would have tried to avoid a war. But that was not the case at all. And if you have any doubts about that, think about what happens immediately after the war starts, when Putin reaches out to the Ukrainians and initiates negotiations to settle the war. These are the famous Istanbul talks that take place in February, March, early April of 2022, immediately after the war starts. It looks like the Ukrainians and the Russians are going to be able to work out some sort of modus vivendi. They're going to be able to cut a deal. They didn't do that, but it looks like they may be able to do that. What happens? The Americans and the British intervene and tell the Ukrainians to walk away. Really quite remarkable. And just to make another point on this very issue, you remember, I think it's in November of 2022, the Ukrainians by that point have done quite well in the war. They've launched 2 offensives where they've taken back territory from the Russians. And General Milley, who's then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, says very clearly that now's the time to cut a deal because this is the high watermark for the Ukrainians. But the Biden administration has no interest in cutting a deal, right? They tell General Milley in so many words that he should stifle himself and stop talking about ending the war. So it's very clear to me that from the beginning, it's been the Americans who were interested in starting and perpetuating this conflict. And Putin, who I think believed he was playing a weak hand, which he was in many ways, was trying to avoid a war.
And now, instead of trying to follow on that same mentality that you just described there about the prior to and then after the start of the war, instead of moving now to a place where, all right, let's just get this albatross off our necks and move back onto a normal life, the Russians are saying, and this is in April from Sergei Lavrov, he says, you know, it looks to me more like the West is preparing for war.
All of these Euro-Atlantic constructions, I think they failed. They failed to consolidate security and stability. What they succeeded in is igniting tension and remilitarizing Europe, including Germany, in spite of the fact that the economic and social situation is degrading. But all efforts of this Euro-Atlantic community are concentrated on getting ready for a new war. And Germany, together with France and Britain, are in the lead of this.
And that was in April. And then now here just a couple of weeks ago, you had U.S. General Donahue stoke that fire a little bit more by bragging about how we can take Kaliningrad. And in the process of that, he says, according to this article here, that the United States Army has the capability to, quote, take that down from the ground in a time frame that is unheard of and faster than we've ever been able to do. We already planned that, he said. And of course, that did not skip any notice in Russia, and it just continues to fuel that fire. So it doesn't look like anyone in the West, whether it's France, Britain, Germany, or the United States, is looking to tamp things down. We seem to be either amping the rhetoric up and moving more troops in. Germany has this year moved troops into Lithuania or into the Baltics area, closer to the Russian border. What do you make of all that?
I think the comments by General Donahue are just crazy. I can't believe he said that. I mean, telling the Russians that you have the capability and you may have the intention to take Kaliningrad. I mean, Kaliningrad is Russian territory. You're talking about NATO invading Russian territory. This is World War III. It's just hard to believe that people talk like this. You know, I came of age in the Cold War. People didn't talk like this in the Cold War. We were just much more cautious in the Cold War. The extent to which people have thrown caution to the wind these days is really quite remarkable. The United States is going to invade Kaliningrad, Russian territory. I mean, this is suicidal. The Russians have nuclear weapons. Do we really want to get into a nuclear war with the Russians over Kaliningrad? My Lord.
Yeah, and I'm puzzled again by what the intent of. I mean, obviously, no four-star general, especially one who's commander of the European command, is going to say something like that just glibly without having it thought through and probably vetted at higher levels. What was the intent of saying something like that, do you think, to try and, I don't know, to scare Russia? Well, I mean, what do you think was even the intent?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I find the behavior so bizarre that I really can't come up with an explanation. Why would you say that? I mean, is this designed to get the Russians to slow down their offensive against the Ukrainian military? I can't believe they thought that. Are they worried that the Russians are going to attack into Eastern Europe? And this is a signal that if the Russians take Poland or Lithuania, we'll take Kaliningrad? I mean, maybe they're thinking that way, but if they are, it's kind of bonkers, if you ask me. I just don't get it. I mean, if you're going to wage a security competition with Russia, or you're going to wage an almost war, I'm choosing my words carefully here, an almost war or a proxy war, all right. But this is, you know, on a whole different level. You're talking about going into Kaliningrad. And you know, when you tell the Russians that this would be easy for you to do, that you'll just roll up Kaliningrad very quickly, you're giving them an incentive in a crisis where they think there may be some chance that you'll do that to preempt, because they may be convinced that you can do it very quickly. And if you look at the geography, you may be able to do it relatively quickly. But again, this is sacred territory.
Yeah.
This is Russian territory. But we have a lot of people who are in charge, you know, or in important positions in the West, who I think never took a course in Strategy 101, or if they took a course in Strategy 101, they failed it. And they talk in ways that I would consider to be irresponsible. And I think what the general said was irresponsible. And it really makes me very nervous about where we're headed.
And of course, that those comments were heard in the Kremlin. So you had Vladimir Putin. This comment I'm about to show came before Donahue said that, but after a great many of these others have, where they're talking about sanctions, and we're talking about giving more weapons. European countries themselves keep making all these military threats against Russia, moving the German troops, etc. So Putin says, "Hey, I see all this, and we're going to make our own conclusions about what needs to come next."
NATO is not going to enlarge to the east. Then one wave of enlargement, the second wave of enlargement. Then they kept expanding, and we were told, well, you should not be concerned, you should not be afraid, it's not a threat to you. And when we said that we do believe it's a threat to us, then they did not say anything in response. They just told us to go far away with our opinions. No one wanted to listen to our opinions, but we know better what is a threat to us. It's our right to define what's a threat to us and how big the threat is from one side or from the other side. But no one was listening to us, and they kept on acting like that. Isn't that an aggressive behavior? Because that's exactly what aggressive behavior means, and the West doesn't want to notice this.
So what do you think is going to happen? Well, actually, a better question, first of all. You see that the Russians are, at least what's being said, don't come across as just this wild-eyed lust for destroying and killing, etc., but they want to be left alone, and they want to have security on their flank against a foreign military alliance. So that doesn't seem entirely unreasonable, and I don't see any evidence, keyword there, evidence, that Russia has territorial expansion desires to the east or to the west into Europe that would appropriately necessitate talks of having a defensive situation here. What do you think then is the actual objective of the West and what appears to me, correct me if you think I'm wrong, in preparing for a frozen conflict, meaning that they want to continue to have some kind of a conflict with Russia even after the Ukraine war is done?
Before I answer your question, Danny, let me just say that it's very interesting, but I think it's true for both of us. We're both Americans, both served in the American military. You, of course, much longer than me. And we're in a situation where we listen to the Russians, who the United States is basically fighting a war against. And we think almost everything the Russians say makes sense. And they're the truth tellers here. In our own government, the American government is not telling the truth much of the time and is making arguments that a rational person can't agree with. It's a really very uncomfortable situation to be in if you think about it.
100% agree. It is as bizarre. I mean, I like you. I grew up in the Cold War. I mean, I served on the front lines of the Cold War, patrolling against Soviet forces in right opposite what was Czechoslovakia and the DDR at the time, and to now see this seemingly reversed, it's hard for me to get my hand around.
Yeah, I mean, I find that I'm at odds with the United States, with what the United States is doing in just so many different situations, and I find it so easy to be critical of the United States. It's quite remarkable. And when I listen to Putin talk, I find it hard to disagree with anything he says from a Russian point of view. But I just wanted to point that out. I think, Danny, what's going on here is very simple. We understand now, and you can even see it in the newspapers, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, that people understand the Russians are going to win. Nobody's sure what that victory is going to look like. It's going to be an ugly victory, but it's going to be a Russian victory. The Ukrainians are going to suffer a humiliating defeat, and NATO and the West and the United States are going to suffer a humiliating defeat. So the question you then have to ask yourself is, how will we respond to that situation? And we will double down. We will not accept defeat. We will look for ways to get back at the Russians and do everything we can to undo their ugly victory. And of course, the Ukrainians will do the same thing, right? The Ukrainians are never going to accept this defeat, and they'll be looking ways to get back the territory that they've lost, including Crimea. And we, of course, will be in cahoots with them. And the question is, what happens then? And, this is where Kaliningrad comes in. As I like to say, there's 6 different flashpoints that are in effect associated with Ukraine and the frozen conflict that's coming. 1 is the Arctic, 2 is the Baltic. There's a lot going on in the Baltic that's very nerve-wracking as well. 3 is Kaliningrad, 4 is Belarus, 5 is Moldova, and 6 is the Black Sea. You can imagine trouble, serious trouble starting in any one of those 6 places, those 6 flashpoints. And given that we're not going to accept defeat and we're going to begin to continue to poke at the Russians and look for opportunities to take advantage of them, which of course means they're going to do the same with us. I want to understand that. They're not going to sit idly by. The potential for trouble in Europe for the foreseeable future is very great. It's a really depressing situation if you think about it.
And so let me just ask you in the last few minutes that we have here, what would make sense? What if President Trump woke up tomorrow morning and says, you know what, this is dumb. I'm not going to listen to Mark Rutte. I'm not going to listen to Emmanuel Macron, Keir Starmer. All they want to do is just make trouble for Russia. I'd rather make business with Russia. So I'm going to do something different. I'm going to call John Mearsheimer and ask him what I should do next. What would you say?
I'm not sure there's very much you can do at this point. I think Trump could do a 180-degree turn, and he could accept the Russians' main demands, and he and Putin could work out some sort of deal. The problem is it would be almost impossible to convince the Ukrainians to accept the deal. It would be almost impossible to convince the Europeans to accept the deal. And as we know from listening to Senator Kennedy and Newt Gingrich and other Americans who represent the mainstream, getting the foreign policy establishment in the United States to go along with that deal that Trump works out with Putin would be extremely difficult. So even if Trump does a 180, which points in the direction of the optimal solution for shutting this war down, he may get out of the batter's box, he may get to first base, but getting around to home plate, I think, is almost impossible. So I think this is one of those cases where there just is no solution at this point.
But it wouldn't. I guess the least bad one would seem then to be this deal, whatever you're talking about, between Putin and Trump could be worked out. And then Trump just says, yeah, Ukraine, you're a sovereign country, do whatever you want. You're just not going to do it with any bullets or bombs from us. Ukraine, Europe, same situation. And folks here, pound sand. He seems sometimes to be willing to tell his own supporters to pound sand when it's something that he feels strongly about. So it seems like maybe he could get up to second base, but just because he does have the power of the presidency, that would seem to be less bad than doing nothing and just letting things take their own course. Do you think so?
Well, this is the argument, correct me if I'm wrong, where you basically say, we've worked out a deal. We're pretending we're Trump here. We've worked out a deal, Vladimir Putin and I, and it'll shut the conflict down if everybody accepts it. And you've made it clear, Ukraine and Europe, that you don't accept it. That's fine, but we're out of here. You're on your own now. And then you trust that the situation on the battlefield is such that the Ukrainians and the Europeans have no choice but to accept the deal with the Russians.
That's right. That's what I'm suggesting.
Yeah, that's what you're suggesting. It's a possibility.
Is that less bad than what we are having right now?
I think that's probably a step in the right direction. It's just the problem, Danny, is it's so hard for me to imagine Trump doing that.
Right.
I mean, that doesn't answer your question. I think your question, I think your instincts are right. It would be better. You'd get to second base, maybe third base. But just on Trump, the problem that Trump faces is that he didn't shut this down immediately. What he had to do was act decisively and use that honeymoon period that he had for, a month or two or three to basically coerce the Europeans and even the Ukrainians to play real hardball with them and play the peacemaker. But he didn't do that. And
Right.
the problem is he's waffled. He's just been all over the place. And for him to do a 180-degree turn now, it's just hard for me to see how he can do this.
Couldn't agree with you more.
And just take Keith Kellogg. In the beginning, it looked like he was going to sideline Keith Kellogg, which I think was smart because Keith Kellogg represented the foreign policy establishment. But Kellogg has come back from the dead, right? And Kellogg is now a player. And there are lots of people in his administration who identify with Kellogg's views. And the fact is, who in the administration agrees with Trump? I mean, who shares Trump's views on Ukraine? I think there's one person, and that's J.D. Vance. And he's not out front on this issue. So it's Trump all alone. He just doesn't have any allies. It's not like the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the House Armed Services Committee is in complete agreement with Trump, and they want to work with Trump. There's nobody who wants to work with Trump, right? They're all opposed. They all want to continue this war forever. And that's where we are. And of course, the Europeans and the Ukrainians think the same way. So in a funny way, Trump is the outlier. But because he was incompetent, and let's face it, he was incompetent and he played his hand so poorly, he's not in a position now where he can overcome all those forces that are arrayed against him.
So last question here. August 9th is coming up. That's the end of this 10-day where Trump is going to at least attempt to do something. He's going to put some more sanctions on Russia. Maybe the secondary part against China, Brazil, India, maybe that doesn't happen, but he'll certainly do some more on Russia. Who cares? But that's what's going to happen. But that's basically going to seal in this path to a frozen conflict that you're talking about here. What is your biggest concern if that happens on August 9th?
Well, I think your description of what will happen is the likely outcome. I find it hard to believe, as I said before, that he would put 500% tariffs on India and China. He's already demonstrated that he can't really play hardball with China because they can play hardball with us. And the idea that he's going to play hardball with India even more than he's done already, I don't think that's going to happen. So I think, he may slap a few more tariffs on Russia, but they're not going to be meaningful. Almost everybody agrees on that point. We don't have any more weapons to give. But what's happening here, and I think this is what you're getting at, is we're just committing ourselves to conflict with Russia forever and ever. Trump is, in effect, not making a gesture, a diplomatic gesture to try and work out some sort of modus vivendi between Moscow and Washington. He's doing the opposite, in fact. And I think given all that's happened since January 20th in terms of relations between Moscow and Washington, this will just make a bad situation worse. And once we get that frozen conflict, we will have poisonous relations between us and Russia for as far as the eye can see. And there'll be that ever-present danger, which we were talking about, of those potential flashpoints turning into conflicts. And by the way, again, you want to remember, we are deeply mired in the Middle East, right? We've got a forever war now with Iran, which is going to continue to do nuclear enrichment. The genocide in Gaza goes on. The Israelis, who were joined at the hip with, are fighting wars in southern Lebanon and southern Syria. And then there's East Asia, right? And the potential for something to go wrong out there is real. And you just really wonder where this is all headed.
Nowhere good.
Nowhere good.
But hey, we all we can do is keep pointing, shining a light on it, giving policy options, but no matter how hard they are, they do exist, and things that could benefit both our country and the world at large if only we had leaders with the courage and the vision to get there. So you have illuminated that, and we really appreciate it. Thank you very much for coming on today.
Thank you for having me, Danny.
And we appreciate you guys too. Also, just a quick reminder, we are on podcast now. Be sure and tell your friends. Some of them I know prefer to get their information via podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict, anywhere you see your podcast, just type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive and they'll find us there. And then also we're expanding out into Substack, which John Mearsheimer also does. We're kind of getting into that world because a lot of people prefer their information via the written format. So there's Daniel Davis Deep Dive, all one word, .substack.com, and you'll find that there too. Be sure to share that with your friends because I know a lot of them probably would like to see it. Thank you very much, and we will look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.